Before we begin, if you enjoy tales that blend history with a touch of the absurd, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more stories that wander into the strange corners of the past. Now let us settle into tonight's chapter, a story of irony, dread, and the least suitable profession for a man with a weak stomach. Chapter 1. The Unfortunate Career Choice. The life of a medieval executioner was not one chosen lightly. It was a profession that clung to a man like a shadow, staining his name, his family, and his prospects. Yet, for Godric of Blackbrook, it was not the social ostracism or the moral weight of the job that made it unbearable. It was the blood. Godric had not set out to be an executioner. In fact, he had never set out to do much of anything. As a boy, he had been squeamish, fainting at the sight of a skinned rabbit, retching at the metallic tang of a butcher's stall. His father, a stern-faced wheelwright, had despaired of him. "A man who cannot stomach blood is no man at all," he would grumble, as Godric turned green yet again at some mundane violence of daily life. Fate, however, has a cruel sense of humor. When the old executioner of Blackbrook died, not by the sword as one might expect, but by choking on a particularly stubborn piece of mutton, the town council was left in a bind. The position was hereditary in theory, passed down through generations of grim-faced men who shared both a surname and a tolerance for gore. But the old executioner had no sons, only a daughter who had married a cooper and moved to the next town over. The council scratched their heads, then their chins, then decided the simplest solution was to conscript the next unfortunate soul who crossed their path in a compromising position. That soul was Godric. He had been caught stealing a loaf of bread. Not out of desperation, mind you, but out of sheer laziness. The baker's wife had seen him, and Godric, never quick on his feet, had tripped over his own shoes in his haste to escape. The councilman, already irritated by the morning's petty disputes, saw an opportunity. "You'll hang for this," one of them said, looming over Godric as he sprawled in the dirt. "Unless another mused you'd care to take up a civic duty." And so, with the enthusiasm of a man walking to his own funeral, Godric became Blackbrook's new executioner. The first time he held the axe, his hands shook so violently that the condemned man, a sheep thief with a resigned expression, actually patted him on the shoulder and said, "Easy, lad. It's me that's dying, not you." Godric did not find this comforting. When the moment came, he shut his eyes, swung blindly, and missed entirely. The axe buried itself in the wooden block beside the thief's head. The crowd erupted in jeers. The sheriff sighed. The thief, now sweating, muttered, "Maybe just hang me next time?" It was not an auspicious start. Worse still was the blood. The first droplet that splattered onto Godric's tunic sent him reeling. The second made his vision swim. By the time the third strike finally did its grisly work, Godric was on his knees, retching into the straw. The townsfolk, initially horrified, soon found it hilarious. "Look at the reaper who can't stand the harvest," someone cackled. The nickname stuck. Godric's days became a miserable cycle of dread and humiliation. Each execution was a fresh torment. He tried remedies, chewing ginger, holding his breath, even drinking himself into a stupor the night before. Nothing worked. The moment the blade struck, his stomach would revolt, his legs would falter, and the crowd would roar with laughter. The only mercy was that Blackbrook was a small town, and executions were rare. But rare was not never. One autumn morning, the sheriff dragged a notorious bandit into the square. This was no sheep thief. This was a man who had slit throats for sport. The crowd was thick, restless, hungry for spectacle. Godric, pale as milk, stood over the block, axe in hand, praying to a god he wasn't sure listened. The bandit, grinning up at him with broken teeth, whispered, "Make it quick, Reaper, or don't. Either way, I'll be laughing at you from hell." Godric closed his eyes. He swung. And so began another day in the life of the most reluctant executioner in medieval England. Chapter 2. A Day in the Life. Godric's mornings always began with the same ritual, a deep, regretful sigh, followed by the careful avoidance of his reflection in the wash basin. He didn't need to see the dark circles under his eyes to know they were there. The life of an executioner was not one that lent itself to restful sleep. The duties of his office were many, and few of them pleasant. Contrary to popular belief, executions were only a small part of the job. Most days were filled with the mundane horrors of medieval justice, floggings, brandings, the occasional dunking of a skull, none of which Godric had discovered were any easier on his delicate constitution than the axe work. Take, for example, the day's first task, the public whipping of a poacher. The man had been caught with a deer carcass slung over his shoulder, and the lord of the manor, a man with all the mercy of a winter frost, had decreed 20 lashes. Godric stood in the square, the whip coiled in his hand like a reluctant serpent, and tried not to think about the way flesh split beneath leather. The crowd murmured impatiently. The poacher, a wiry fellow with the resigned look of a man who had been here before, spat on the ground and muttered, "Just get on with it." Godric took a deep breath. He raised the whip. The first strike landed with a wet crack, and the poacher's back arched. Godric flinched. The second strike was worse. By the third he was sweating, his stomach churning like a butter vat left in the sun. The crowd, sensing weakness, began to jeer. "Put some back into it, Reaper," someone shouted. "Or are you afraid you'll hurt him?" The truth was, Godric was afraid he'd hurt him. Not because he cared, though he supposed he did, in a distant, guilty way, but because the sight of blood made his knees wobble. By the 10th lash, the poacher's back was a mess of red, and Godric's vision was swimming. He swayed on his feet, gripping the whip like a lifeline. The sheriff, watching from the sidelines, rolled his eyes. "For God's sake, man, it's not you being whipped." Godric wasn't so sure. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of small miseries. There was the branding of a thief. Godric had to look away as the hot iron seared the man's palm, and the public shaming of a baker caught selling underweight loaves. The baker was locked in the stocks, where children pelted him with rotten vegetables. Godric, tasked with overseeing the punishment, spent the hour trying not to inhale the stench of spoiled turnips. By noon, he was exhausted. He retreated to the executioner's hut, a ramshackle thing on the edge of town, as far from respectable company as possible, and collapsed onto a stool. The hut smelled of old blood and damp straw, a combination that never failed to make his stomach turn. He poured himself a cup of weak ale, drank it in one go, and pretended it helped. The afternoon brought no respite. There was a hanging scheduled, a sheep thief, the same one who had joked about Godric's incompetence weeks earlier. The man had been caught again, this time with 3 ewes and a rather indignant ram stuffed into his barn. The sheriff had declared the noose a kinder fate than the ram's horns. Godric stood beneath the gallows, the rope rough in his hands, and tried not to think about the mechanics of neck-breaking. The thief, surprisingly cheerful for a man moments from death, winked at him. "Try not to miss this time, eh?" Godric did not miss, but he did vomit. The crowd, now thoroughly accustomed to this part of the spectacle, cheered as Godric emptied his stomach into the dirt. The sheriff sighed and handed him a cloth. "You're the worst executioner I've ever seen," he said, not unkindly. Godric wiped his mouth and nodded. He knew. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Godric trudged back to his hut, his body aching, his spirit even more so. He lit a single candle. Wax was expensive, and the town didn't pay him enough to waste it, and stared into the flickering light. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. Godric wondered, not for the first time, how he had ended up here. He wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't cut out for any of it. But then, that was the cruel joke of it all, wasn't it? No one chose to be an executioner. The job chose you. And once it had you, it never let go. Chapter 3. The Blood Phobia Revealed. Godric had always known, in some vague and distant way, that he did not care for blood. As a child, he had fainted at the sight of his own scraped knee. As a young man, he had once vomited into a hedge after watching a butcher disjoint a pig. But it wasn't until his first real execution that he understood the true depths of his affliction. The day had begun like any other, badly. Town crier had woken him at dawn with the cheerful announcement that a condemned man awaited justice in the square. Godric had groaned into his pillow, briefly considered fleeing to the next village, and then dragged himself upright. There was no escaping it. The job was his, and if he didn't do it, the sheriff would simply find someone else to do it to him. The condemned was a highwayman, a wiry, sunburned fellow with a missing front tooth and an air of weary resignation. He had been caught red-handed, quite literally, after a botched robbery left him with a gash across his palm and a trail of blood leading straight to the tavern where he'd been drinking away his spoils. Now he stood on the scaffold, hands bound, squinting against the morning sun as the crowd jeered. Godric climbed the steps with all the enthusiasm of a man ascending the gallows himself. The axe felt obscenely heavy in his hands, the wood of the handle slick with his sweat. The sheriff, standing to the side with his arms crossed, gave him an expectant nod. The highwayman, sensing Godric's hesitation, smirked. "First time, eh?" Godric swallowed. He had practiced this. In the quiet of his hut, he had swung a broom handle at an imaginary neck 100 times. But now, with the real thing before him, his arms felt like lead. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, impatient. Someone threw a rotten apple. It missed Godric, but splattered against the scaffold, the sickly sweet stench of decay mingling with the smell of fresh-cut wood and unwashed bodies. The sheriff cleared his throat. Godric raised the axe. The highwayman, perhaps sensing that cooperation would lead to a quicker end, knelt without further prompting and laid his head on the block. The back of his neck was pale beneath a fringe of greasy hair. Godric's hands shook. He swung. The blade bit deep, but not deep enough. The highwayman let out a choked cry, more surprise than pain, as blood welled from the gash in his neck. The crowd gasped. Godric, staring at the crimson rivulet seeping into the wood, felt the world tilt. His ears roared. His vision darkened at the edges. The axe slipped from his fingers and thudded into the scaffold. The highwayman, still very much alive, lifted his head and blinked at him. "That the best you can do?" Godric opened his mouth to reply, and then his legs gave out. He came to on his back, staring up at the sky, with the sheriff's scowling face hovering over him. Around them the crowd was in an uproar, half laughing, half shouting in disgust. The highwayman, still bound, was sitting up now, craning his neck to see what the delay was. The wound on his neck had slowed to a sluggish trickle, but the front of his shirt was soaked. Godric turned his head and vomited. The sheriff sighed. "Christ's bones, man, you're the executioner." Godric, wiping his mouth with a trembling hand, could only nod. He knew. He knew. It was one thing to faint at the sight of blood in the butcher's stall. It was another, entirely, to collapse in the middle of an execution, leaving your victim half decapitated and very confused. The sheriff hauled him upright, shoved the axe back into his hands and hissed, "Finish it, now!" Somehow, Godric did. The second swing was wild, but it did the job. The highwayman's head dropped into the basket with a dull thump. The blood, God, the blood, fountained, splattering across the front of Godric's tunic, his hands, his face. He didn't faint this time. He wished he had. Instead, he stood there, swaying, his skin clammy, his stomach heaving, as the crowd's jeers washed over him. Afterward, as he scrubbed his hands raw in the trough behind the scaffold, the sheriff clapped him on the shoulder, hard enough to stagger him. "You'll get used to it," he said, as though this were a comforting thought. Godric stared at his trembling, water-wrinkled fingers and knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not. The walk back to his hut was a blur. He passed the butcher's stall, where a pig's carcass hung, glistening and red. He passed a group of children playing with a dead rat, poking it with a stick. He passed a woman plucking a chicken, its feathers drifting around her like snow. Everywhere, blood. By the time he reached his door, his breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. He stumbled inside, bolted the door behind him, and sank to the floor, pressing his forehead against the cool dirt. He was an executioner. He was terrified of blood, and there was no way out. Chapter 4. The town's reactions. News traveled fast in Blackbrook, especially when the news was as deliciously embarrassing as the town executioner fainting at his own scaffold. By the time Godric dragged himself out of his hut the next morning, the story had already sprouted wings and taken flight across the market square, the alehouse, and even the church pews. The butcher was the first to comment. As Godric shuffled past his stall, eyes fixed firmly on the ground to avoid the usual array of carcasses, the man leaned over his counter and said, "Loud enough for the entire street to hear, 'Need any help carrying your axe today, Reaper?' Looks heavy." The crowd of women haggling over mutton ribs tittered. Godric walked faster. The alewife at the tavern was less subtle. When Godric slunk in at midday, hoping for a drink to steady his nerves, she plonked a tankard in front of him and said, "On the house." Never seen a man more in need of strong drink, or less able to handle it. The men at the neighboring tables roared with laughter. One of them, a tanner with 4 arms like tree trunks, clapped Godric on the back hard enough to slosh ale onto the table. "Heard you left that highwayman more confused than dead," he chuckled. "Poor bastard didn't know whether to curse you or thank you for the delay." Even the children had taken to reenacting the scene in the streets. A group of them had set up a makeshift scaffold near the well, where a particularly bold boy played Godric with exaggerated swoons and dramatic retching sounds, much to the delight of his audience. The girl playing the highwayman kept sitting up mid-execution to ask in a shrill falsetto, "Are you quite done?" "Only I've got places to be." Godric considered moving to a different town, possibly a different century. The sheriff, at least, seemed more exasperated than amused. He cornered Godric outside the courthouse, arms crossed, jaw working like he was chewing on something particularly unpleasant. "You're making a mockery of the law," he said flatly. Godric opened his mouth to protest, but the sheriff cut him off. "I don't care if you have to drink a barrel of wine before you swing that axe. Next time you finish the job in one blow, or I'll find someone who can." The threat should have frightened him. Instead, Godric felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the sheriff would replace him. Maybe this nightmare would end. But Blackbrook was a small town, and qualified executioners were in short supply. No one else wanted the job. No one else was foolish enough to take it. The town council, when Godric was summoned before them, proved equally unsympathetic. They sat in a row behind a long oak table, their faces varying degrees of displeasure. The mayor, a portly man with a beard like a bramble thicket, drummed his fingers on the wood. "This is unacceptable," he said. "We can't have the law's enforcer swooning like a milkmaid at a hanging." One of the councilmen, a Weasley fellow with a perpetual squint, leaned forward. "Perhaps we could blindfold him?" A second councilman snorted. Then he'd miss the block entirely and take someone's head off in the crowd. They debated solutions with the gravity of men discussing crop rotations. "Stronger drink?" A heavier axe. A stool to sit on between blows. At one point, the mayor suggested hiring a second man to stand behind Godric and prop him up if he wavered. Godric, slumped in his chair, said nothing. In the end, they settled on a compromise. Godric would practice daily on pumpkins. And so, every morning at dawn, while the rest of the town slept off the previous night's ale, Godric stood in the execution yard, hacking at gourds with increasingly savage frustration. The pumpkins, to their credit, were more forgiving than human necks. They did not bleed. They did not groan. They did not look up at him with resigned disappointment when he missed. But they also did not make him any better at his job. By the end of the week, the sheriff declared the experiment a failure. "You've massacred enough vegetables to feed the poor for a winter," he said, kicking a mutilated pumpkin aside. "And yet you still swing like a man who's never held an axe before." Godric wiped his brow. "Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." The sheriff gave him a long, measured look. "No," he said finally, "you're not." For one glorious moment, Godric thought he was free. Then the sheriff sighed and said, "But you're what we've got." And with that, Godric was dismissed. The townspeople, at least, had begun to adjust. The jokes still came, but they were less vicious now, more resigned. Blackbrook had always been a town of hard luck and harder people. If Godric was their punishment for some collective sin, well, they'd bear it. The baker, a pragmatic woman with flour permanently dusted in her hair, even took pity on him. She began leaving a loaf of bread at his door every Sunday, wrapped in a cloth. It was always slightly burnt, the rejects, the ones she couldn't sell, but Godric appreciated the gesture. The children, too, had moved on to fresher amusements. A traveling bard had arrived in town, and his tales of dragons and doomed romance were far more exciting than the spectacle of a queasy execution. Only the condemned seemed to hold a grudge. The next man to face the block, a sheep thief, the same one who'd endured Godric's bungled axe work weeks before, glared up at him as he knelt. "You," he said flatly. Godric adjusted his grip on the axe. The thief shook his head. "Just my luck." This time, Godric managed a clean strike. And this time, when the blood spilled, he only swayed a little before catching himself. Progress, perhaps. Or just another day in the life of the worst executioner in Blackbrook. Chapter 5. Creative Avoidance Tactics. Desperation, Godric discovered, was a remarkable motivator for creativity. After months of public humiliation and private nausea, he had begun to view each new execution not as an obligation, but as a puzzle to be solved. How could a man who trembled at the sight of a skinned rabbit maintain the grim facade of a professional headsman? The answer, it turned out, lay in a combination of bribery, theatricality, and outright deception. His first attempt at circumventing bloodshed involved the town gravedier, a grizzled old man named Oswin who smelled perpetually of damp earth and seemed to regard corpses as mildly irritating acquaintances. Godric found him one evening, shoveling dirt onto a pauper's grave, and made his proposition. "A silver penny if you'll do the next beheading for me," he blurted. Oswin paused, leaning on his shovel. "Why?" "Because I'll give you a silver penny." Oswin considered this. "2 pennies, he said finally, "and you help me bury the body after." Godric agreed. The arrangement worked beautifully, until the day of the execution when Oswin, having downed 3 tankards of ale for courage, swung the axe with such enthusiasm that it lodged in the scaffold's wooden beam. The condemned man, a poacher with the patience of a saint, waited nearly 10 minutes while Oswin and the sheriff wrestled the blade free. By the time the deed was done, the crowd's mood had soured from bloodlust to boredom, and Godric's reputation had somehow worsened rather than improved. Worse still, Oswin demanded an extra penny for unexpected labor. Plan abandoned. Next, Godric turned to the realm of excuses. A sudden fever the morning of an execution. A twisted ankle. A recurring bout of the falling sickness that conveniently struck only when the axe was in his hand. The sheriff, unimpressed, began arriving at Godric's hut the night before, each sentencing to ensure he was neither ill nor miraculously crippled by dawn. Then came the era of delegation. Godric trained, if one could call his fumbling demonstrations training, a rotating cast of assistants, a butcher's apprentice who quit after 1 session, a retired soldier who laughed in his face, and finally, in a moment of true desperation, the town's half-blind carpenter. The carpenter, at least, was willing, though his first attempt left the condemned man with a grievous shoulder wound and the sheriff with a headache. For God's sake, the sheriff snapped. Just do it yourself. But Godric had one final strategy, born of sheer panic and a budding appreciation for the macabre theatrics of his profession. If he couldn't avoid blood, he could at least avoid seeing it. The solution arrived in the form of a black hood. Not for the condemned, those were common enough, but for himself. Godric stitched it painstakingly over 3 sleepless nights, adding a narrow slit for visibility just large enough to see the block, but not so large as to reveal the aftermath. He tested it in his hut, swinging a broom at a sack of straw, and deemed it serviceable. The townsfolk naturally thought it was ridiculous. "Are you playing hangman or highwayman?" the butcher shouted as Godric ascended the scaffold, hood pulled low over his face. The crowd tittered. The sheriff pinched the bridge of his nose. The condemned man, a sheep thief with a perpetual smirk, said, "If you're robbing me, I should warn you I've nothing left to steal." Godric ignored them all. He positioned the man at the block, stepped back, and raised the axe. The hood muffled sound slightly, but more importantly, it narrowed his world to a single, bloodless point of focus. The spot where the blade needed to fall. He swung. The thief's head dropped neatly into the basket. The body crumpled. The crowd, for once, was silent. And Godric, miracle of miracles, did not faint. He did, however, trip over his own feet while descending the scaffold, tearing the hood on a protruding nail. But even that couldn't dampen his triumph. For the first time since taking up the axe, he had executed a man without vomiting, swooning, or requiring divine intervention. The sheriff, watching him untangle himself from the ruined hood, sighed. "I suppose it's an improvement." Progress, Godric decided, was relative. In the weeks that followed, he refined his technique. The hoods grew sturdier, his aim more precise. He experimented with scented herbs, stuffed into the fabric to mask the smell of blood, with reinforced stitching to prevent tearing, even with a second, thinner layer of cloth to further obscure his vision. The townspeople, initially skeptical, began placing bets on how many swings he'd need, or whether he'd manage to keep his breakfast down afterward. The baker started leaving 2 loaves at his door. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were still mishaps. The time he misjudged the distance and nicked the sheriff's boot. The afternoon a stiff breeze blew the hood, askew mid-swing, but for the most part it worked. And if the price of survival was looking like a particularly inept bandit every time he performed his duties, well, Godric could live with that. After all, the condemned men rarely complained. Chapter 6. The Physician's Dubious Advice. The hood had been a temporary solution, not a cure. Godric knew it, the sheriff knew it, and, judging by their continued snickering, the townsfolk knew it too. What he needed, he decided, was professional intervention. And so, on a damp morning that smelled of rotting leaves and unwashed livestock, he found himself standing outside the home of Blackbrook's only physician, a man named Dr. Theobald, whose reputation hovered uneasily between questionable and outright fraudulent. Theobald's practice occupied a crooked little house near the tannery, where the stink of curing hides masked less savory odors. The sign above the door, depicting a serpent wrapped around a staff, had faded to near illegibility, and the door itself hung slightly askew, as though even the wood had lost faith in the enterprise. Godric hesitated, then knocked. The man who answered was tall and gaunt, with a nose like a hatchet and fingers stained yellow from years of handling dubious tinctures. He peered down at Godric with the air of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something far more interesting. "Ah," he said, "the fainting executioner." Godric winced. "I was hoping for a consultation." Theobald stepped aside, ushering him into a room that smelled strongly of vinegar and something suspiciously like burned hair. Jars lined the shelves, their contents ranging from ordinary herbs to objects Godric couldn't, and didn't want to, identify. A human skull grinned from a corner shelf. A pair of rusted forceps lay on the table like a discarded weapon. The physician gestured for Godric, to sit on a stool that looked as though it had been salvaged from a shipwreck. "Let me guess," he said. "You faint at blood. How did you—" "You're the talk of the town, boy. Now, hold out your wrist." Godric obeyed. Theobald grasped his arm with bony fingers, pressing 2 stained fingertips to his pulse. He hummed, frowned, then leaned in, uncomfortably close to peer into Godric's eyes. Yes, the humors are clearly imbalanced." Godric blinked. "Which ones?" "All of them," Theobald said gravely. "Your blood is too hot, your phlegm too cold, your black bile excessively melancholic, and your yellow bile, well, frankly, it's a mess." He released Godric's wrist and turned to rummage through a drawer, emerging with a small stained notebook. "I recommend leeches." "Leeches. To balance the humors. We'll apply them to your forehead before your next execution. The bloodletting should prevent any undue excitement." Godric opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I don't think—" "Alternatively," Theobald continued, flipping a page, "we could try a poultice of crushed earthworms and turnip paste. Applied to the soles of the feet, of course. The worms draw out the fear through the skin." "Of course," Godric echoed faintly. Theobald squinted at him. "Or if you're feeling adventurous, I've recently acquired a most fascinating specimen, the powdered skull of a hanged man. Mixed with honey and taken daily. It's said to impart the courage of the deceased." Godric stared. "You want me to eat a dead man's skull?" "Only a little." Godric considered his options. He could leave now and continue stumbling through executions in a state of perpetual terror. Or he could place his fate in the hands of a man who apparently thought cannibalism was medicinal. He sighed. "How much for the leeches?" Theobald grinned, revealing a row of teeth like ancient tombstones. "For you, 6 pence." The treatment was, predictably, a disaster. The morning of the next execution, Godric sat on the edge of his bed while Theobald pressed 3 fat, squirming leeches to his forehead. They latched on with unsettling enthusiasm, their bodies swelling as they fed. Theobald stepped back, admiring his handiwork. "There, you feel calmer already." What Godric felt was lightheaded and itchy, and increasingly certain that this had been a terrible idea. By the time he reached the scaffold, the leeches had gorged themselves to the point of bursting. One detached mid-march, plopping onto his boot with a wet slap. The remaining 2 dangled precariously as he climbed the steps, drawing horrified murmurs from the crowd. The condemned man, a poacher with a perpetually unimpressed expression, took one look at Godric and said, "Christ alive? Are you dying too?" The sheriff, who had not been informed of the treatment plan, looked as though he were seriously considering arresting Theobald instead. "What in God's name is on your face?" "Leeches," Godric mumbled. "For the humors." The sheriff closed his eyes briefly, as though praying for patience. "Just get on with it." Godric raised the axe. The leeches wobbled. The crowd held its breath. He swung. The blade struck true, cleaving cleanly through the poacher's neck. Blood sprayed. The leeches, sensing their moment, detached in unison, landing in the gore with tiny, eager splashes. Godric looked down. Then he looked at the leeches, now writhing happily in a puddle of fresh blood. Then he fainted. When he came to, he was lying in the dirt behind the scaffold, the sheriff looming over him with an expression that suggested he was seriously reconsidering the town's stance on capital punishment. Theobald stood nearby, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Perhaps too much bloodletting." Godric groaned. "I have another idea," Theobald said brightly. "A tonic of fermented toadskin. It's excellent for the nerves." Godric closed his eyes. "I'd rather die." Theobald nodded. "That can also be arranged." The sheriff, with the air of a man reaching the end of his tether, grabbed Godric by the collar and hauled him upright. "No more physicians," he growled. No more leeches. No more, God help me. Powdered skulls. You're going to do your job. Badly. But you're going to do it. Godric, swaying slightly, nodded. As they walked away, Theobald called after them, "If you change your mind about the toadskin, I give a discount for repeat customers." Godric did not change his mind. That evening, he sat in his hut, forehead bandaged where the leeches had left angry red marks, and contemplated his choices. He could continue as he was, a fainting, stumbling mockery of an executioner. He could flee in the night, and take his chances as a beggar on the road. On this was the most terrifying option of all. He could accept that he was terrible at his job, and that no amount of leeches, tonics, or hoods would change that. Outside, an owl hooted. Somewhere in the distance, a drunkard sang off-key. Godric poured himself a cup of ale, drank it in one long swallow, and decided that tomorrow was a problem for tomorrow. For tonight he would simply sit in the dark and try not to think about powdered skulls. Chapter 7. The Executioner's Apprentice. The solution arrived as most disasters in Godric's life did, on a Tuesday. He was in the middle of his now customary pre-execution, vomiting ritual behind the courthouse, when a shadow fell across him. Expecting the sheriff with another lecture on professionalism, Godric wiped his mouth and prepared his standard apology. Instead, he found himself staring up at a boy. Not just any boy. A beaming, bright-eyed, utterly deranged-looking boy of about 14, clutching a rusted meat cleaver in one hand, and a sack of what smelled suspiciously like rotting meat in the other. "You're the executioner," the boy said, with the reverence most children reserve for knights or legendary warriors. "I want to be your apprentice." Godric, still tasting bile, blinked. "What? Your apprentice?" the boy repeated, as if this were the most natural request in the world. He hefted the sack, which oozed something dark onto the ground between them. "I've been practicing." Against his better judgment, Godric peered into the sack. The remains of what might have once been a rabbit, or possibly a very small dog, stared back at him with glassy, accusatory eyes. The boy had clearly been hacking at it with enthusiasm, if not precision. Godric closed the sack. "What's your name?" "Bedtime, Meeting, Gang, Sivikundik Nombe. Viglaf, Tunkt und." The boy nodded eagerly. "After the hero from the sagas. My mum says I've got the temperament for great deeds." Godric eyed the gore-streaked cleaver. "Great deeds," he echoed. Viglaf's grin widened. "I don't faint at blood." That, at least, was promising. In fact, as Godric would soon learn, doesn't faint at blood was an understatement. Viglaf didn't just tolerate blood, he reveled in it. The boy could watch a butcher at work for hours, rapt as a child at a puppet show. He dissected roadkill with the precision of a scholar poring over ancient texts. Once, when a chicken escaped the coop and met its end under a cart, Wiglaf had been the first to volunteer for plucking duty. Not because he was helpful, but because he wanted to examine the way the neck had snapped. He was, in short, exactly the sort of person who should have been the executioner. And so, the sheriff's grudging approval, Godric took on an apprentice. Their first lesson was axe maintenance. Wiglaf, it turned out, had strong opinions about blade angles. "You've been sharpening it wrong," he announced, running a thumb along the edge with the casual disregard of someone who still had all 10 digits. "See how the bevel's uneven? That's why you keep getting stuck in the block." Godric, who had never considered there might be a right way to decapitate people, nodded weakly. Their second lesson was stance. "You lean away when you swing," Wiglaf said, demonstrating with a practice law. "That's why your blows go wide. You've got to commit." He brought the axe down in a perfect arc, burying it deep in the wood. Godric tried to copy him. The axe glanced off the side of the log and nearly took off his own foot. Wiglaf sighed. "We'll work on it." By the end of the week, Wiglaf could split a log in one blow, while Godric still struggled to lift the axe without straining his back. By the end of the month, Wiglaf was correcting the sheriff's knotwork on the nooses. "Hangman's loop's too loose," he'd say, "or the drop's not long enough. You'll just strangle them slow." The sheriff, after the third such correction, began bringing Wiglaf sweets in what Godric suspected was thinly veiled bribery to shut him up. The townspeople, initially wary of the bloodthirsty child lurking around the scaffold, soon embraced him. Wiglaf was everything Godric wasn't: enthusiastic, competent, and, most importantly, entertaining. He regaled crowds with grisly facts about medieval punishments, while waiting for executions to begin. He cheerfully explained the difference between a clean beheading and a botched one, to anyone who would listen, and several who wouldn't. Once, when a particularly nasty murderer spat at Godric, Wiglaf had calmly informed the man that he just guaranteed himself the rusty axe instead of the sharp one. Godric, meanwhile, found himself increasingly relegated to the role of assistant. He carried the tools. He swept the scaffold. He held the condemned steady while Wiglaf did the actual work. It should have been humiliating. Instead, it was a relief. For the first time since taking up the axe, Godric could stand on the scaffold without his vision tunneling. He could breathe without his stomach trying to vacate his body. He could even, on good days, watch the proceedings without needing to lie down afterward. Not that Wiglaf let him off entirely. "You've got to learn," the boy insisted, shoving the axe into Godric's hands at least once a week. "What if I die of plague? What if I run off to join a mercenary band? You can't be useless forever." Godric suspected he could, in fact, be useless forever, but he humored the boy. He practiced his swings. He studied the angle of the blade. He even, on one memorable occasion, managed to behead a pumpkin without injuring himself or bystanders. Progress too. The only problem, as the sheriff pointed out one evening over ale, was legality. "The boy can't do the executions proper," he said. "Not till he's grown. The law is clear on that." Godric, who had been enjoying his newfound irrelevance, sighed. "So I'm still the official headsman." "Afraid so." The sheriff took a long drink. "But between you and me, I think we all know who's really running the show." Outside, the sound of Wiglaf enthusiastically explaining the best way to disembowel a man to a group of horrified and fascinated villagers drifted through the window. Godric nodded. Fair enough. That night, as he lay in bed listening to Wiglaf snore in the corner, the boy had insisted on moving into the executioner's hut, claiming it was part of the apprenticeship. Godric allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. Perhaps with Wiglaf's help he could survive this wretched job. Perhaps he could even, dare he think it, become passably competent. Then Wiglaf sleep mumbled something about trying the rack tomorrow, and Godric decided to take it one day at a time. Chapter 8. A Botched Execution. The morning of the botched execution began like any other, with Godric retching into a bucket, while Wiglaf sharpened the axe with unsettling enthusiasm. The condemned man was a notorious horse thief named Edmund, who had somehow managed to offend every noble in the Shire by stealing their prize stallions and giving them ridiculous names. "That's not a war horse," the Earl of Blackbrook had reportedly sputtered upon finding his champion destrier, adorned with flowers and answering to Buttercup. "You look terrible," Wiglaf observed as Godric wiped his mouth. "I feel terrible," Godric admitted. "You always feel terrible," Wiglaf said, testing the blade against his thumb. "But today you look worse than usual. Is it the sweating sickness, the pox, the—" "It's the execution," Godric interrupted. Wiglaf blinked. "But we do executions all the time." "Yes, but this one's different," Godric said, pacing the cramped hut. "The sheriff says the Earl is coming to watch, and the Baron, and possibly the Bishop." Understanding dawned on Wiglaf's face. "Ah, So if you faint, you'll do it in front of important people. Godric groaned and put his head in his hands. By the time they reached the scaffold, a sizable crowd had gathered, including the promised assortment of nobles. The Earl of Blackbrook stood front and center, his impressive mustache quivering with anticipation. The Baron lurked nearby, looking vaguely disappointed that the thief hadn't stolen any of his horses. The bishop, a frail man with watery eyes, clutched a handkerchief to his nose as if the very air of justice offended him. Edmund the horse thief, meanwhile, seemed remarkably cheerful for a man moments from death. He winked at a pretty girl in the crowd and joked with the guards as they led him up the steps. When he caught sight of Godric's pale face, he grinned. "Don't look so glum, headsman. It's not your neck on the block." Godric wished he shared the man's optimism. Wiglaf handed him the axe with a solemn nod. "Remember," the boy whispered. "Sharp angle, firm grip, and for God's sake, don't look at the blood." Godric took the axe, his palms already slick with sweat. The crowd hushed. The Earl leaned forward. Even the Baron looked briefly interested. Edmund knelt at the block with practiced ease, resting his chin on the worn wood. "Make it quick, eh?" he said. "I'd hate to keep the nobles waiting." Godric raised the axe and froze. It wasn't the weight of the weapon or the expectant silence of the crowd that stayed his hand. It wasn't even the thought of the blood, though that certainly didn't help. No. What paralyzed Godric was the sudden, overwhelming realization that he was about to kill a man who had named a warhorse Buttercup. The moment stretched. The axe quivered in Godric's grip. A fly buzzed lazily around Edmund's ear. "Any time now," Edmund prompted. Godric swallowed hard and swung. The blade struck with a wet thunk, not cleanly through the neck as intended, but awkwardly into the shoulder. Edmund yelped. The crowd gasped. The Earl's mustache performed a complicated dance of outrage. Blood, bright and terrible, welled from the wound, soaking Edmund's tunic. Godric stared at it, his vision narrowing to that single, horrifying crimson stain. The axe slipped from his numb fingers, clattering to the scaffold. "Oh dear," Edmund said, craning his neck to examine the damage. "That's not supposed to happen, is it?" Godric opened his mouth to reply, but his knees chose that moment to buckle. He collapsed in a heap, his head swimming, his stomach revolting. Somewhere in the distance, Wiglaf sighed. Chaos erupted. The Baron began loudly demanding his money back, as if he'd paid for entertainment rather than justice. The bishop fainted clean away, toppling into a group of startled nuns. The Earl's mustache achieved levels of quivering previously thought impossible. Through the haze of his panic, Godric saw Wiglaf spring into action. The boy snatched up the fallen axe, shoved Edmund back into position, and, with one clean stroke, finished the job. The crowd went silent. Then the Earl began to clap. Slowly at first, then with greater enthusiasm. The Baron, not to be outdone, joined in. Soon the entire square echoed with applause, punctuated by the occasional groan from the recovering bishop. Wiglaf took a bow. Godric, still on his hands and knees, wondered if it was possible to die of embarrassment. Later, as they cleaned the scaffold, as Wiglaf cleaned while Godric sat with his head between his knees, the sheriff approached. He regarded Godric with the weary expression of a man who had long since run out of patience. "That," he said, "was the worst execution I've ever seen." Godric nodded weakly. "And yet," the sheriff continued, rubbing his temples, "the Earl says it's the most entertainment he's had in years. The Baron wants to know if we can schedule another for next week. The bishop is writing a poem about it." Wiglaf beamed. "Does this mean we get a raise?" The sheriff ignored him. "From now on," he said to Godric, "you're officially the worst executioner in England. Congratulations." As the sheriff walked away, Wiglaf clapped Godric on the back. "See, everything worked out." Godric looked at the bloodstains on the scaffold, then at the cheering crowd, then at Edmund's head in the basket. "I need a drink," he said. Wiglaf nodded sagely. "I'll fetch the powdered skull tonic." Godric reconsidered. "On second thought, I'm fine." And so England's worst executioner lived to fail another day, much to the delight of nobles, the despair of clergymen, and the eternal amusement of his apprentice. Somewhere, Buttercup the warhorse neighed mournfully, as if sensing the injustice of it all. Chapter 9. The King's Decree. Word of the botched execution reached the king's ears within a fortnight, carried by messengers who could scarcely keep straight faces as they relayed the tale. King Edmund II, no relation to the unfortunately named horse thief, though this coincidence would later cause considerable bureaucratic confusion, was not known for his sense of humor. He was, however, famously fond of proclamations, edicts, and the general exercise of power in its most petty and impractical forms. The news that one of his executioners had fainted mid-decapitation, and that this had somehow delighted the nobility, provoked exactly the sort of disproportionate response for which he was renowned. The royal decree arrived in Blackbrook on a scroll so large it required 2 pages to carry it. The town crier, a man with lungs like bellows and a flair for the dramatic, read it aloud in the square as the entire population gathered to hear their fate. Godric stood near the back, half hidden behind a particularly broad cheesemonger, while Wiglaf perched on a rain barrel for a better view. "By order of His Royal Majesty, King Edmund II," the crier boomed, "the following decrees are henceforth enacted in response to the disgraceful and unprofessional conduct of the executioner of Blackbrook." Godric sank lower behind the cheesemonger. First, the crier continued, "all future executions within the kingdom shall be performed at dawn, so that any fainting may be discreetly attributed to the early hour rather than cowardice." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Second, any executioner who vomits, swoons, or otherwise demonstrates weakness during his duties shall be fined no less than 10 silver pennies per offense, payable directly to the royal treasury. The cheesemonger in front of Godric turned and gave him a sympathetic look. Third, in recognition of the entertainment value provided by the Blackbrook executioner's incompetence, he is hereby commanded to perform at the king's annual midsummer festival, where his failures shall serve as amusement for the court. Wiglaf let out a low whistle. Godric made a small strangled noise. The crier pressed on, undaunted. Fourth, to ensure no further embarrassment to the crown, the executioner of Blackbrook shall henceforth be accompanied at all times by a royal observer, appointed by His Majesty to document and, if necessary, rectify any failures in the administration of justice. At this, a wiry man in an absurdly feathered hat stepped forward, bowing with a flourish. "Gervais of Locksley," he announced, "at your service." Godric peeked around the cheesemonger to get a better look at his new minder. Gervais was a slight man with the sharp, calculating eyes of a weasel, and a smile that suggested he took entirely too much pleasure in other people's misfortunes. Fifth and finally, the crier concluded, should the executioner of Blackbrook continue to prove incapable of his duties, he shall be replaced, not by his apprentice, who has demonstrated alarming competence, but by a trained monkey, which His Majesty has already procured for this purpose. A hush fell over the square. Wiglaf broke it. "What kind of monkey?" The crier consulted his scroll. "A Barbary macaque, apparently." "Those are quite clever," Wiglaf mused. Godric made another noise, this one higher pitched. The royal observer, Gervais, wasted no time in asserting his authority. He installed himself in Godric's hut that very afternoon, commandeering the only comfortable chair and making copious notes in a little leather-bound book. "For the king's records," he explained, though Godric strongly suspected the notes were for Gervais' personal amusement. "The bed is mine," Gervais announced. "You may sleep on the floor. The boy can stay, but only because His Majesty finds him amusing." Wiglaf, who had been examining Gervais' feathered hat with great interest, nodded. "Can I train the monkey if Godric gets replaced?" "Absolutely," Gervais said. Godric put his head in his hands. The first execution under the new regime was, if possible, even worse than usual. The condemned, a sheep thief who had somehow managed to offend both the earl and the bishop by stealing a particularly holy lamb, knelt at the block with the air of a man who knew he was part of a spectacle. Gervais stood to one side, quill poised, observing everything with the intensity of a vulture circling carrion. Godric raised the axe. His hands shook. Gervais made a note. He swung. The blade struck. Not cleanly, but not disastrously either. A glancing blow that left the thief wounded but very much alive. The man lifted his head from the block and said mildly, "That's not how you do it." Godric looked at the blood, then at Gervais, who was scribbling furiously, then at Wiglaf, who shrugged and mouthed, "Monkey." Then he fainted. When he came to, Wiglaf was finishing the job with practiced efficiency. The crowd was cheering, and Gervais was reading aloud from his notes. Subject displayed textbook symptoms of cowardice, including but not limited to trembling, excessive perspiration, a dramatic swoon, and what appears to be minor urinary incontinence. I did not. Godric began hotly, then stopped when he realized the crowd was hanging on Gervais' every word. "The king will be most interested," Gervais said, smiling his weasel smile. "Most interested indeed." That, as Godric lay on the hard floor of his hut, Gervais having claimed the bed as promised, he contemplated his options. He could flee in the night and take his chances as an outlaw. He could throw himself on the king's mercy, though mercy was not something the king was known to possess in any measurable quantity. Or he could wait for the inevitable moment when a Barbary macaque took his job, his hut, and possibly his apprentice. Outside, an owl hooted. Gervais snored. Wiglaf muttered something in his sleep about improved blade angles. Godric closed his eyes. Somewhere in the royal menagerie, a monkey waited. Chapter 10. The Executioner's Secret. Rumors in Blackbrook had always spread like the plague, only with less death and more creative embellishment. By the third execution under Gervais' watchful eye, whispers about Godric's condition had mutated from mild curiosity to full-blown speculation. The townsfolk no longer simply thought him incompetent. They had theories. The baker's wife insisted he was under a witch's curse, doomed to fail at every execution until he broke the hex. The blacksmith swore he'd seen Godric drinking a suspicious potion before each beheading, which the younger apprentices immediately decided was either a love charm or dragon's blood. Even the children had begun inventing songs about the reaper who couldn't reap, which they chanted while skipping rope past his hut. Gervais, of course, encouraged every rumor. He would linger in the tavern after executions, buying rounds of ale for anyone who could provide fresh gossip about Godric's latest failure. "Tell me," he'd say, leaning in with theatrical concern, "did you notice how he trembled when the blood sprayed? Most curious indeed." Worst of all were the moments when Godric caught Wiglaf watching him with an uncharacteristically thoughtful expression. The boy had taken to studying him during practice sessions, his sharp eyes missing nothing, the way Godric's breath hitched when the axe bit into fresh meat, how he'd developed a habit of staring at the horizon during executions to avoid looking directly at the blood. "I've been thinking," Wiglaf announced one evening as they cleaned the tools, while Gervais lounged in the hut, sampling the king's wine rations. "There might be another way." Godric paused in his scrubbing. "Another way to what?" "To do the job." Wiglaf dropped his voice to a whisper. "Without you having to look at the blood." For one wild moment, Godric imagined some miraculous solution. A blindfold that actually worked, perhaps, or a mechanical device that would swing the axe for him. Wiglaf continued. "We could switch places." Godric blinked. "What?" "Just hear me out," Wiglaf said, his eyes gleaming with the particular intensity he usually reserved for discussions of disembowelment techniques. "You wear my clothes, I wear yours. The hood covers your face anyway. Who's going to know it's not you swinging the axe?" That's treason, Godric hissed. It's practical, Wiglaf countered. It's punishable by death. Wiglaf shrugged. So's botching executions. At least this way you'd be good at the thing you're being executed for. Godric opened his mouth to argue, but the creak of the hut door interrupted him. Gervais stood silhouetted against the firelight, holding a half-empty goblet of wine and wearing an expression of feline amusement. Plotting something, are we? Just discussing blade maintenance, Wiglaf said smoothly. Of course you were. Gervais took a leisurely sip of wine. Tell me, executioner, how is it that a man who faints at the sight of blood came to hold such a position? The question hung in the air, like the blade of a guillotine. Godric's mind raced through possible lies. A sudden affliction, a war wound that weakened his constitution, an act of God. But Wiglaf, ever helpful, chimed in first. He lost a bet, the boy said solemnly. Gervais, an eyebrow. A bet? Aye, Wiglaf continued, warming to his tale. With the old executioner, drunken wager in the tavern, if Godric lost, he'd take the job for a year. Only no one expected the old man to choke on that mutton bone the very next day. Godric stared at his apprentice. The story was absurd. It was also, he realized with dawning horror, exactly the sort of ridiculous misfortune that would befall him. Gervais studied them both for a long moment before bursting into laughter. Oh, that's rich, he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. The king will adore that. As Gervais staggered back inside to refill his wine, Godric turned to Wiglaf. That was either the smartest or stupidest thing you've ever done. Wiglaf grinned. Now he'll be too busy laughing to notice when we switch places. The plan, against all logic and several laws of both man and nature, worked. At the next execution, a poacher who had somehow managed to offend both the nobility and the local wildlife, Godric took his place on the scaffold, in his usual oversized hooded robe. The crowd murmured as he raised the axe, no doubt expecting another humiliating collapse. What they didn't know was that beneath the voluminous fabric, Wiglaf stood on a carefully concealed stool, gripping the axe with his small but capable hands, while Godric, also hidden within the robe, stood behind him, providing height and bulk, while staring fixedly at the back of the hood. The axe fell. The poacher's head rolled. The crowd gasped, and not a single drop of blood was seen by Godric's traumatized eyes. Afterward, as they packed up the tools, Gervais approached with an unreadable expression. For one heart-stopping moment, Godric was certain they'd been discovered. Then, the royal observer patted him on the back, a bit too hard to be friendly, and said, "One clean execution doesn't erase months of incompetence, but it's a start." That night, for the first time in living memory, there were no new songs about the reaper who couldn't reap. The baker's wife revised her witch's curse theory to include the possibility of divine intervention. Even the sheriff looked at Godric with something resembling respect. Only Wiglaf seemed unimpressed. As they lay in the dark, Gervais having once again claimed the bed, the boy whispered, "We'll need to work on your stance. You're throwing off my balance when you sway." Godric, staring at the ceiling, smiled and noted. Outside, an owl called. Somewhere in the distance, the king's monkey chittered in its cage. And in the executioner's hut, a secret took root, one that, if discovered, would undoubtedly lead to more heads rolling than usual. Chapter 11. The Witch's Curse. Godric's brief moment of triumph lasted exactly 3 days before the baker's wife's witch theory gained alarming traction. It began with whispers in the market square, grew to murmurs outside the church, and by week's end had blossomed into full-blown hysteria when old Nan's prize hen stopped laying eggs. "It's the curse spreading," the baker's wife declared to a rapt audience at the tavern. "First it took the executioner's stomach, now it's coming for our livestock." Gervais, who had taken to recording these theories in a special section of his notebook titled Peasant Idiocy, couldn't have been more delighted. "Fascinating," he murmured, quill scratching furiously. "And who do you suppose cast this curse?" The answer came immediately from Widow Hargrove, who had never liked her neighbor's cat. "Maggie Bear," she spat. "That woman's been odd since the day she moved here. Never comes to church, keeps toads in her garden, and her stew has an unnatural savor to it." Godric, who had been cornered near the ale barrels, felt compelled to point out that good stew seasoning hardly constituted witchcraft. This proved unwise. "The executioner defends her," the blacksmith's apprentice cried. "Another victim of her dark arts." By nightfall, a mob had formed outside Maggie Birch's cottage, a lopsided little structure on the edge of town that did, Godric had to admit, look rather witchy in the moonlight. The crowd brandished torches, badly resulting in several singed sleeves, pitchforks, mostly gardening tools, pressed into service, and one extremely confused ferret that someone had mistaken for a demonic familiar. Maggie emerged not with cackles and threats, but with a wooden spoon and an expression of profound irritation. "For the last time," she said, whacking the blacksmith's apprentice with the spoon when he got too close. "I'm not a witch. I'm a midwife, and if you idiots burn me, who's going to deliver your next batch of half-witted babies?" This gave the mob pause. Gervais, sensing entertainment slipping away, cleared his throat. Perhaps a trial would settle the matter. The town, which had never needed much excuse for a spectacle, seized on the idea with gusto. A makeshift court was assembled in the square, using barrels for benches and Widow Hargrove's best linen tablecloth for judicial decorum. The sheriff, who had been hoping for a quiet evening, found himself pressed into service as judge. Maggie was given a stool to sit on, after much debate about whether it might be enchanted, and the proceedings began. "The accused shall face the ducking stool," the baker's wife proclaimed. "The accused shall face proper evidence first," the sheriff countered wearily. "What proof have you of witchcraft?" The list was extensive. Maggie's garden grew suspiciously robust rosemary. She often hummed while working, in an allegedly ominous tone. Last winter, she had predicted the snow would stop by noon, and it had. At 5 past. Most damning of all, her ginger cake was suspiciously moist. Through it all, Maggie rolled her eyes and muttered about idiocy being the real plague upon the village. Godric, who had been trying to edge away unnoticed, found himself dragged into the proceedings when Wiglaf piped up. "If it's a curse making Godric faint at blood, wouldn't removing the curse solve everything?" The crowd murmured agreement. The sheriff looked heavenward for strength. Gervais's quill nearly flew across the page with excitement. Maggie fixed Wiglaf with a glare. "You're not helping, boy." The trial might have continued all night had not the Earl's steward arrived bearing news. "His lordship requests the witch's services," the man announced. "The countess is in labor." A hush fell. Even the most ardent witch hunters knew better than to interfere with noble succession. Maggie stood, dusted off her skirts, and jabbed her spoon at the assembly. "This isn't over." Then she marched off to deliver a baby, leaving the town to grumble about postponed justice. As the crowd dispersed, Wiglaf sidled up to Godric. "You know, if we convinced everyone the curse was broken, they might stop expecting you to improve." Godric eyed the retreating mob. "How would we do that?" Wiglaf grinned. "We'll need a chicken, some blue dye, and possibly a small explosion." Over by the tavern, Gervais watched them with narrowed eyes, no doubt already drafting his report to the king about the curious behavior of cursed executioners and their unnaturally clever apprentices. The moon hung heavy over Blackbrook that night, casting long shadows across the executioner's hut, where, if one listened closely, one might hear the sound of scheming, the cluck of a very confused chicken, and the occasional cackle that definitely didn't come from any witch. Chapter 12. The Executioner's Escape Plan. The morning after the disastrous witch trial, Godric awoke with a single burning conviction. He needed to escape Blackbrook. The realization came not in a flash of inspiration, but in the slow, creeping way that water wears down stone. After months of humiliation, near misses, and the constant threat of being replaced by a monkey, The idea of fleeing had transformed from fantasy to necessity. The problem, of course, was how. Medieval England was not particularly accommodating to men seeking fresh starts. Godric lay on the hard floor of his hut. Gervais still commandeered the bed, and mentally catalogued his options between Wiglaf's snores and the Royal Observer's nasal whistling. Option 1. Join a monastery. This had promise. Monasteries were quiet, peaceful places where a man could spend his days copying manuscripts or brewing ale, far from scaffolds and splattering blood. There was just the minor matter of the vow of chastity, irrelevant, the vow of poverty, he was already broke, and the vow of obedience, problematic given his track record with authority. Worse, the nearest monastery was St. Bartholomew's, whose abbot happened to be the brother of the earl he'd recently embarrassed. The odds of being turned away at spear point were high. Option 2. Become an outlaw. This was less appealing. While tales of merry men living free in Sherwood Forest sounded romantic in songs, the reality involved sleeping in ditches, eating questionable mushrooms, and generally being hunted like a stag in season. Godric had once gotten a rash from sleeping on straw that was slightly too damp. The idea of spending his nights in actual forests was untenable. Besides, his only marketable skill was execution, and most bandit gangs already had people for that. Option 3. Fake his own death. This had theatrical potential but practical flaws. He'd seen enough botched executions to know how hard it was to convincingly kill someone, let alone oneself. Even if he managed it, there was the issue of reappearing elsewhere. Medieval towns tended to notice when new residents bore a striking resemblance to recently deceased executioners. Option 4. Simply walk away. The simplest solution, and therefore the one most likely to go catastrophically wrong. Executioners were technically property of the crown. Leaving without permission would make him a fugitive, and the last fugitive he'd executed had taken 3 axe swings to finish. The irony wasn't lost on him. A rustling sound interrupted his thoughts. Wiglaf was awake, watching him with unnerving perceptiveness. "You're thinking of running," the boy whispered. Godric didn't bother denying it. "Any suggestions?" Wiglaf sat up, eyes gleaming with mischief. "We could join a traveling carnival. You'd be the amazing fainting headsman. I'd be the boy who knows too much about dead things." "Be serious." "I am. We'd make a fortune." Godric sighed. Over breakfast, stale bread, and what might have been cheese or possibly soap, they debated alternatives. Wiglaf proposed disguising Godric as a leper. No one questions a hooded figure who rings a bell, then pivoted to suggesting they both become pirates. They need people who can handle blades, and you're technically good with an axe when not fainting. Gervais, who had been pretending not to listen while eavesdropping shamelessly, finally interjected. "You do realize desertion is punishable by execution, yes?" He took a leisurely bite of bread. "Rather ironic, given your profession." Godric glowered. "You'd like that, wouldn't you? Another scandal for your royal reports?" Gervais smiled his weasel smile. "I do live to serve." The conversation might have ended there had not a commotion erupted outside. The Countess had given birth, 2 twins no less, and Maggie Birch was being carried through town on a litter like a conquering hero, the Earl's steward proclaiming her a credit to womanhood, and definitely not a witch. The same villagers who had brandished torches the night before now cheered and threw flowers. Wiglaf watched the procession with narrowed eyes. Then he turned to Godric. "I've got it." "Got what?" "The perfect escape." The plan, as Wiglaf explained it later in hushed tones behind the slaughterhouse, where the smell ensured privacy, was breathtaking in its audacity. They would not run. They would not hide. They would make Blackbrook so eager to be rid of Godric that the sheriff himself would suggest his departure. Phase 1 involved Godric accidentally freeing the king's monkey during its visit for the midsummer festival. Phase 2 required Wiglaf to spread rumors that Executioner and Monkey had formed an unholy alliance. Phase 3, the masterstroke would see Godric publicly declare his intention to join a monastery, at which point the entire town would likely pool funds to speed him on his way. "It's foolproof," Wiglaf declared. Godric had doubts, mainly about which part of Free the Temperamental Barbary Macaque sounded foolproof. But as he watched Gervais taking notes on the still celebrating crowd, no doubt plotting how to twist this development to his advantage, he realized he was out of better ideas. That evening, as he packed his meager belongings, an extra tunic, a rusted dagger, and the now infamous black hood, Godric allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there was life beyond the scaffold. Perhaps he could find some quiet corner of England where no one needed heads removed from shoulders with any regularity. Then Wiglaf burst in with news that the Midsummer Festival had been moved up. The monkey was arriving tomorrow, and they'd need to procure at least 3 pounds of bananas as distraction. As escape plans went, it wasn't dignified. It wasn't even particularly well thought out. But as Godric lay down to sleep, his last night, if all went well, as Blackbrook's executioner, he consoled himself with one thought. At least the monkey would probably do a better job. Chapter 13. The Final Straw. The morning of the Midsummer Festival dawned bright and sickeningly cheerful. Banners fluttered between the thatched roofs, children darted through the streets with stolen sweets, and the air smelled of roasting meat and impending chaos. Godric stood at the edge of the scaffold, watching as workers erected platforms for the day's festivities, including, he noted with dread, a gilded cage for the king's monkey. Wiglaf appeared at his elbow, clutching 3 suspiciously blackened bananas. "The baker only had these left," he said. "They might be poisonous." Godric eyed the shriveled fruits. To us or the monkey? Only one way to find out. Before they could plot further, the sheriff arrived, his expression suggesting he'd already had far too much festival before breakfast. "We've got a problem," he said, jerking his thumb toward the stocks, where a familiar figure slumped in misery. Adric the Simple, the village idiot, turned accidental arsonist, blinked up at them with his usual vacant smile. His latest crime, burning down half the mill while trying to help by lighting what he swore was a very cold fire, had earned him the festival's opening execution slot. Godric groaned. "Today, of all days?" The sheriff shrugged. "The Earl wants it done before the monkey arrives. Says it's bad luck to have 2 attractions competing for attention." Adric, catching sight of Godric, beamed. "Hello, Mr. Reaper. Are we playing the head-chopping game again?" Godric closed his eyes. The execution was every bit the disaster he anticipated. Adric, convinced this was some grand festival game, kept popping up from the block to ask if he was doing it right. The crowd, already in a festive mood, treated the whole affair as entertainment, placing bets on how many attempts it would take. Gervais observed from the front row, sipping wine and taking notes with undisguised glee. Godric raised the axe. His palms were slick with sweat. The blade wavered in the sunlight. First swing. Adric ducked at the last second, giggling. Second swing. The axe caught in his matted hair, requiring Wiglaf to pry it free. Third swing. Finally connected, but only enough to open a gash along Edric's scalp. Blood sprayed. Godric froze. It wasn't the sight alone that undid him, though the crimson arc painting the scaffold certainly didn't help. It wasn't even Edric's cheerful oe, as Wiglaf hurried to staunch the wound. It was the realization, crashing over him with the weight of 1,000 axes, that he simply couldn't do this anymore. The axe slipped from his fingers. The crowd hushed. Gervais leaned forward, quill poised. And Godric, Blackbrook's executioner, the reaper who couldn't reap, the man who had fainted, vomited, and bungled his way through months of botched justice, did something far worse than any of that. He laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a nervous titter. But great, heaving guffaws that shook his entire body and sent tears streaming down his face. He laughed at the absurdity of it all, at Edric's blood dripping onto the festival banners, at the monkey cage being erected just paces away, at his own spectacular incompetence. He laughed until he couldn't breathe, until the crowd began backing away nervously, until even Wiglaf looked concerned. Gervais was the first to speak. "Well," he said, snapping his notebook shut with finality, "that settles that." The sheriff, torn between horror and relief, made the sign of the cross. "Someone fetch the monkey." Edric, still bleeding cheerfully, piped up, "Can I have my turn with the axe now?" What followed wasn't so much an executioner's dismissal as a town's collective sigh of relief. The sheriff declared Godric temporarily relieved of duties pending royal review. The earl offered the monkey a ceremonial banana. Wiglaf, showing remarkable presence of mind, began auctioning off Godric's tools to the highest bidders. By sundown, Godric found himself standing at Blackbrook's edge, clutching a hastily packed sack containing 2 loaves of bread, burnt from the baker's wife, a wedge of questionable cheese from Widow Hargrove, who still thought him cursed, and his original stolen loaf. The one that had started this whole mess. Wiglaf appeared beside him, holding out the black executioner's hood. "For the road," he said. "Might rain." Godric took it. "What will you do now?" Wiglaf grinned. "Train the monkey, marry the earl's daughter, become king." He shrugged. The usual. Dot. Behind them, the festival roared on, the monkey's indignant screeches blending with drunken singing. Ahead lay the road, dusty, uncertain, and infinitely preferable to the scaffold. Godric adjusted his pack and took his first step toward whatever came next. It couldn't, he reasoned, possibly be worse. Somewhere, in the distance, a chicken crossed the road. It was, all things considered, a better omen than he deserved. Chapter 14. The Fall from Grace. Godric's first night as a former executioner was spent in a ditch. Not out of despair, though there was certainly some of that, but because the farmer whose hayloft he'd hoped to sleep in took one look at him and crossed himself with enough vigor to ward off plague, famine, and bad harvests in a single gesture. "You're that headsman," the farmer had said, brandishing a pitchfork like Godric might infect his livestock with incompetence. "The one who laughs at his own work." Godric considered explaining that he hadn't been laughing at the execution per se, but at the cosmic absurdity of his entire existence. Then he saw the farmer's grip tighten on the pitchfork, and decided the ditch was preferable. Dawn found him sorry, damp, and profoundly aware of how few options lay before him. Executioners, it turned out, were not well suited for career changes. The skills that made one proficient at separating heads from shoulders, steady hands, strong stomach, general indifference to screaming, didn't translate well to other professions. He tried the blacksmith first. "Ever worked a forge?" the smith asked, not looking up from the horseshoe he was hammering. "No," Godric admitted. "But I'm good with blades." The smith snorted. "From what I hear, you're good at dropping them." Next was the cooper, who took one look at Godric's hands, still faintly stained with Edric's blood, and declared he wouldn't trust him to barrel a rotten fish. The tanner suggested he try his luck in the next county. The weaver pretended not to speak English. By midday, Godric slunk to the tavern, where at least his coin, what little remained after Wiglaf's apprenticeship termination fee, would still buy ale, if not respect. The tavern keeper, a pragmatic sort, served him without comment but made a show of scrubbing the tankard afterward. The other patrons edged away, leaving Godric in a widening circle of solitude. He'd been an outcast before, all executioners were, but this was different. Before, they'd feared his office. Now, they pitied his failure. The only person who would meet his eye was Gervais. The royal observer sauntered over, still carrying that damned notebook, and sat without invitation. "I've been compiling a list," he said cheerfully. "Potential occupations for disgraced executioners. Care to hear? Godric took a long drink. Rat catcher. Gervais tapped the page. Though given your history with small squealing creatures, perhaps not. Gravedigger? No. Too much blood there. Ah, here's one, village fool. The last one burned down the mill, so there's an opening. Godric set his tankard down with deliberate care. What do you want? Gervais' smile didn't reach his eyes. The king finds your continued presence unsettling. A failed executioner is like a mute bard or a cowardly knight. It upsets the natural order. He slid a folded parchment across the table. You're to leave Blackbrook by sundown tomorrow. Official decree. Godric didn't need to read it to know what it said. Exile was the kindest option. The king could have demanded his head, and might yet if he lingered. Outside, the sound of cheering drew them both to the window. In the square, Wiglaf was directing the monkey through what appeared to be a mock execution. The creature, wearing a tiny black hood, swung a wooden axe at a melon while the crowd roared approval. He'll make a fine headsman, Gervais mused. Once he's grown into the position, or the monkey will. Hard to say at this point. Godric didn't answer. He was too busy watching the boy who'd been his only ally, the only person who'd seen his weakness and tried to help rather than exploit it, now thriving in his absence. That night, Godric slept in his old hut for the last time. The sheriff had granted him this much mercy, though the man had changed the locks and removed anything sharp first. Even the straw pallet was gone, leaving only hard-packed earth. Wiglaf found him there at first light, bearing a sack that clinked promisingly. Stole it from Gervais, he said, dumping the contents. Wine, cheese, and what looked like the Royal Observer's spare hat onto the floor. Thought you could use supplies. Godric picked up the hat. It was ridiculous, all feathers and pretension. I'm leaving today. I know, but an alien. Wiglaf sat cross-legged, suddenly serious in a way children so rarely were. Where will you go? North, maybe. Somewhere they haven't heard of me. They'll hear eventually. Godric smiled faintly. Then I'll keep moving. They sat in silence for a while, passing the wine back and forth. Outside, the monkey screeched, and someone shouted what sounded like encouragement. Blackbrook was moving on. Finally, Wiglaf stood. I saved you something. He tossed a small bundle to Godric, the black executioner's hood, carefully folded. For the road, he said again, just as he had at the town's edge. Godric tucked it into his pack without comment. Some things defied words. When the time came to leave, he did so quietly, slipping through the back lanes rather than brave the square and its new entertainments. Only at the last crossroads did he pause, looking back at the place that had been his prison and his purgatory. Then he turned north, where the roads were poor, the villages sparse, and the chances of anyone needing an executioner, even a bad one, were slim. Somewhere behind him a crowd laughed. Ahead, a crow cawed, and Godric of Blackbrook, England's worst executioner, walked on. Chapter 15. A New Profession. The village of Misselford had no executioner. This was the first thing Godric noticed upon arrival, and the fact filled him with cautious optimism. The second thing he noticed was the smell. A thick, greasy odor that clung to the thatch and hung over the lanes like a curse. Pig fat, explained the toothless crone, who took his last copper in exchange for a bowl of something that might have been stew. We render it here. The smell drives off bandits and wives alike. She cackled at her own joke, revealing gums like old leather. Godric, who had eaten worse in his days as Blackbrook's least effective headsman, swallowed the stew without complaint. More concerning than the taste was the crone's next question. What brings you to Misselford, then? Running from something or running toward? Neither, Godric lied. Looking for work. The crone's eyes, milky with cataracts but unsettlingly sharp, flicked to his hands. What can you do? This was the question that had haunted his journey north. What could he do, besides fail at killing people in increasingly embarrassing ways? He opened his mouth to say something vague about tools and blades, but the crone cut him off. "We've need of a leech collector." Godric blinked. "A what?" "Leeches," she repeated, as if speaking to a simpleton. "For the physician. He pays a penny per dozen, more if they're fat." She gestured to the murky stream that bordered the village. "They thrive in the shallows, especially after rain." Godric considered this. Leeches were, admittedly, better than executions. They didn't scream. They didn't bleed, at least, not in the way that made his vision swim. And they presumably didn't judge a man for fainting. "I'll take it," he said. The crone cackled again. "Thought you might." Leash collecting, as it turned out, was a profession perfectly suited to a disgraced executioner. It required no skill beyond patience, no tools but a bucket, and no interaction with villagers beyond the occasional exchange of slimy creatures for coin. The physician, a skeletal man who bore a worrying resemblance to the corpses Godric had once dragged from scaffolds, paid promptly and asked no questions. There were drawbacks, of course. The leeches attached themselves with enthusiastic disregard for personal boundaries. Godric's legs became a patchwork of tiny wounds that itched abominably, and the smell of the marsh clung to him even after washing, making him nearly as unpopular in Misselford as he'd been in Blackbrook. Still, it was honest work, or at least not murder. Weeks passed in a damp, sanguineous haze. Godric fell into a routine, wade at dawn while the leeches were sluggish, deliver his catch by midday, spend the afternoon picking at his wounds and avoiding human contact. It was, if not happiness, at least peace. Then the pig festival came. Mr. Ford's annual celebration of all things porcine was, by local standards, a grand affair. There were races, pig versus child, usually a close match. Competitions: fattest pig, ugliest pig, pig most likely to eat its young, and of course the ceremonial rendering of the festival hog. Godric, who had learned the hard way that attending village events only led to trouble, planned to spend the day in his ramshackle hut. Fat, as usual, had other ideas. Physician found him just past sunrise, clutching a bloody rag to his nose and vibrating with excitement. "The pig renderer's taken ill," he announced. "Food poisoning. You'll take his place." Godric stared. "I don't know how to render pigs." "Boil the fat. Skim the impurities. Don't burn down the village." The physician pressed a rusty knife into Godric's hand. "They're waiting." The festival crowd had gathered around the rendering cauldron, a massive iron pot suspended over a fire pit. The hog, an enormous surly beast that had apparently won both fattest and most likely to eat its young in years past, lay on a plank nearby, already dispatched. Godric approached with the caution of a man walking to his own execution. The crowd cheered. Someone thrust a tankard of ale into his hand. A child poked the pig experimentally. "Begin," cried the mayor, a pig farmer by trade and, judging by his girth, a connoisseur by habit. Godric raised the knife. The crowd hushed. And then, because the universe had a sense of humor, he hesitated. It wasn't the blood this time. Godric had grown somewhat accustomed to blood, thanks to his leech-collecting ventures. It wasn't even the act of butchery itself, though he'd certainly never excelled at that either. No, what stayed his hand was the sudden, absurd realization that he was about to publicly fail at yet another profession. The crowd murmured. The mayor frowned. The pig, in silent judgment, continued being dead. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called, "Need help, old man?" Godric turned. A girl of maybe 12 stood with her arms crossed, her expression a perfect blend of scorn and amusement. She had straw-colored hair, a nose that had clearly been broken at least once, and the confident bearing of someone who'd been rendering pigs since she could walk. The mayor brightened. Young Bess knows the trade. Her father was our best renderer before thee. He made a vague gesture that might have indicated plague, murder, or unfortunate dice game. Bess didn't wait for invitation. She strode forward, took the knife from Godric's limp hand, and set to work with brutal efficiency. Within minutes the pig was in pieces, the cauldron was bubbling, and the crowd had lost interest in Godric entirely. He expected scorn as he slunk away. Instead, Bess cornered him later by the ale tent, her hands still glistening with fat. "You're that headsman," she said. "The one who botched the beheading so bad they got a monkey to do it." News traveled fast, even to pig-rendering villages. Godric braced for mockery. Bess surprised him. "You any good with a knife? Really?" Godric considered lying. Then he remembered the pig. "No, Doctonen. Thought not." She wiped her hands on her apron. "But you know what leeches are worth in the next county? Twice what that skinflint physician pays. I know a traitor." Godric blinked. "You're proposing." "Partners, Bessie. I handle the pigs. You handle the leeches. We split the profits." It wasn't a glamorous offer. It wasn't even a particularly good one. Bess clearly intended to handle the money, and Godric doubted he'd see more than a third of the true profits. But it was something. A purpose. A place. He took her outstretched hand, sticky with pig fat, and promised. Somewhere to the south, a monkey was probably swinging an axe to thunderous applause. Somewhere to the north, the leeches waited. And here, in this smelly porcine nowhere, Godric of Blackbrook, failed executioner, adequate leech collector, and now junior partner in Bess's burgeoning animal byproducts empire, found something dangerously close to peace. The festival raged on around them. A piglet escaped its pen and barreled through the crowd. Someone started a drinking song, and Godric, for the first time in recent memory, laughed without dread of what tomorrow might bring. Kind of Story. Chapter 16. Legends and Rumors. Years passed, as they tend to do, with little regard for the lives of leech collectors or former executioners. Godric's days in Misselford settled into a rhythm of damp mornings in the marsh and quiet evenings by Bess's hearth, where they tallied earnings and argued over whose turn it was to scrub the blood from their tools. The villagers stopped crossing themselves when he passed. The physician paid his leech rates without complaint, and even the pigs seemed to tolerate him, which in Misselford passed for acceptance. But while Godric found obscurity in pig fat and parasites, his legend grew legs of its own back in Blackbrook. The first time he heard the tale retold, he was delivering leeches to a traveling merchant bound for the south. The man, a garrulous sort with a face like a dried apple, held court in the tavern, regaling villagers with news from distant towns. "Speaking of Blackbrook," the merchant said, pausing for dramatic effect, "you'll never guess what they've got as executioner now." Godric's hand tightened around his tankard. "A monkey?" guessed the miller's wife. The merchant waved this away. "That was last season. No, they've got the boy now, that Wiggler fellow, but that's not the strange part." He leaned in. "They say the post is cursed, that the original headsman, poor bastard, was bewitched by a witch so beautiful she turned men's bones to water. Every time he raised his axe, her face would appear in the blood, and he'd swoon like a maiden." Godric choked on his ale. The merchant continued, warming to his theme. "Some say she was the king's own mistress, punishing the headsman for executing her lover. Others claim she was a spirit of justice, preventing him from killing the innocent. Either way, they say on moonless nights you can still hear him laughing at the scaffold, forever trapped between swing and strike." It took 3 pints and a promise of discounted leeches before Godric could pry the full story from the merchant. Apparently, Blackbrook had turned his failure into folklore. The witch, sometimes beautiful, sometimes hag-like, depending on who was telling the tale, had become a fixture. The monkey was now said to be an enchanted prince. Wiglaf had somehow gained the ability to smell guilt. The most absurd part, Godric thought as he trudged back to Bess's cottage, was that they'd made the whole thing tragic. In reality, there'd been no curse, no doomed romance, just a man spectacularly unsuited to his job. Yet somehow, history was sanding down his edges, turning his humiliation into something poetic. Bess, when he told her, snorted into her stew. "So you're a romantic figure now? Should I start swooning when you come home, stinking of marsh?" "Please don't." The stories grew wilder with each retelling. A year later, a tinker claimed the Blackbrook executioner had been in love with the witch, and that's why he couldn't spill blood. A minstrel composed a ballad about the gentle headsman who spared 100 men because their eyes reminded him of his lost love. By the time Wiglaf, now apparently calling himself Wiglaf the Unerring, sent word that he was coming to Misselford on royal business, Godric half expected to hear he'd sprouted wings and a halo. The reunion, when it came, was less dramatic than the legends suggested. Wiglaf arrived on a nondescript mare, his royal sigil barely visible under a layer of road dust. He'd grown taller, his shoulders broader, but his grin was the same as when he'd first proposed switching places on the scaffold. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting, eyeing Godric's mud-caked boots and leech-stained tunic. "You look like you robbed a tailor," Godric retorted, though in truth the boy, no, the man now, cut an impressive figure in his royal colors. They repaired to the tavern, where Wiglaf entertained the locals with, heavily embellished, tales of court, while Godric drank quietly in the corner. Only when the crowd had dispersed did Wiglaf slide onto the bench opposite him and get to the point. "They want you to come back." Godric set his tankard down carefully. "Who does?" "The king, the sheriff, half the nobles in the court." Wiglaf smirked. "Turns out, an executioner who faints at blood is excellent for keeping convictions down. No one wants to risk a botched public spectacle, so they only bring me the truly guilty now." Godric stared. "You're joking." "Am I?" Wiglaf leaned in. "You're a legend, Godric. The man who defied the crown by being terrible at his job. The nobles love the story. The peasants love that fewer people are dying. Even the monkey got a pension." Outside, the sounds of Misselford's evening rituals carried through the shutters. The clatter of pans, the squeal of pigs, Bess yelling at some hapless villager about proper fat-rendering technique. It was a far cry from the scaffold's drama. The crowd's roar, the weight of an axe in his hands. "I can't," Godric said at last. Wiglaf didn't seem surprised. "Didn't think you would, but the offer stands if you ever want to be terrible at something important again." They drank in comfortable silence until Bess came to drag Godric home, complaining about leeches that wouldn't collect themselves. Wiglaf left at dawn, taking his royal sigil and outrageous stories back south, where they belong. Years later, when travelers passed through Misselford, they sometimes remarked on the old leech collector who laughed at tales of the gentle headsman. The villagers would shrug and say old Godric had always been strange about blood. And somewhere in Blackbrook, a monkey slept on silk cushions, dreaming of bananas and axes, and the man who'd made its rise to power possible. Final chapter. Chapter 17. The moral of the story. They say every tale should leave its audience wiser than it found them. If that's true, then the story of Godric of Blackbrook ought to have left all of England philosophers. Yet wisdom, like execution techniques and properly rendered pig fat, often depends on one's perspective. Take, for instance, the children of Misselford. They learned that if you're going to fail at something, fail so spectacularly that people write songs about it. The village baker's boy, after setting fire to 3 consecutive loaves, declared himself the Godric of bread-making and promptly got a raise when customers came to witness the disasters. The nobles of Blackbrook took a different lesson, that mercy could be profitable provided it looked like incompetence. The Earl, who had once been so particular about his executions, now presided over trials with startling leniency. "Best not risk another spectacle," he'd murmur whenever a particularly guilty noble stood before him. The dungeons emptied, the taverns flourished, and somehow crime decreased. Wiglaf, now the most celebrated executioner in 3 counties, understood the truth that fear makes fools of everyone, even kings, even headsmen. He kept a leech in a jar on his desk as a reminder. As for Godric himself, he would tell you there was no moral, only the stubborn persistence of life in the face of absurdity. Each morning still found him knee-deep in marsh water. Each evening still ended with Bess complaining about the smell. The leeches still bit. The pigs still stank. The world still turned. And if travelers sometimes paused at the sight of an old man laughing to himself as he waded through the reeds, well, that was just the nature of stories. They grow in the telling, just as legends grow in the memory. Just as leeches grow fat on blood they were never meant to drink. The truth was plain enough. Some men are born to greatness. Some achieve greatness. And some have greatness thrust upon them, only to faint at the sight of it. Kann es irgendwie zu end.